Hi everyone, and welcome to week 5 of our course. Thus far, we've unpacked the multiple traditions of rights discourses pre-1948. This week marks the second half of our course, which explores the evolution of human rights through related concepts. Our focus this week is on Holocaust memory. As usual, here are our learning objectives. Alright, so let's start with reading 1, where we pick back up again with Sam Moyne. In this chapter, he argues that the development of human rights in the 1940s was effectively stillborn, snuffed out in the crib by great power politics, as the idealistic promise of human rights was co-opted by the reality of the nascent Cold War. He also argues that human rights discourse served to mask other agendas, particularly with the post-war reconstruction of Europe and a political settlement between the US and the USSR. And perhaps most controversially, he contends that human rights were not a response to the Holocaust, the latter of which wasn't even known as the Holocaust for another couple of decades. Now, it's important to untangle these claims. So it's one thing to say that the popularity of human rights began as a wartime slogan, and it's another to suggest that the horrors of World War II weren't an impetus to this normative development. And we'll see a strong argument to the contrary in reading 3. But first, reading 2 includes a couple of chapters from this textbook by Paul Gordon Lauren. Generally speaking, this textbook represents the traditional linear narrative in human rights historiography, or the idea that the history of human rights constitutes a series of progressive steps, all leading up to the 1948 Universal Declaration. It is this linear narrative that is fundamentally critiqued by Sam Moyne and other so-called revisionists. In any case, despite its length, this very readable account provides a thorough overview of the wartime and post-war diplomatic negotiations and institutional developments that led to an important breakthrough for human rights. Now, I like this reading for several reasons. For one thing, it looks at how wartime proclamations from the Allied powers exposed Western leaders to hypocrisy. For another, it also shows how non-governmental actors popularized the idea of human rights. But as far as our purposes are concerned, this reading exposes the inherent tension in the post-war order between two dueling principles, inviolable state sovereignty on the one hand, and universal human rights on the other. This returns us to a central paradox in the history of human rights, which, again, are supposed to protect individuals from the state, but which require the state to implement. So use this reading to provide some historical context to this paradox. Now, reading 3 is by American historian Johannes Morsink, who has been a preeminent scholar of the Universal Declaration, at least for the past quarter century or so. And this brief reading is the introduction to his recent book, which in strong and explicit opposition to Sam Moyne's revisionist thesis, argues that the revelatory experience of the Holocaust, as well as the perception of it as a singular event in human history, lends a powerful moral force to the Universal Declaration. That is to say, our commemoration of the radical evil of the Nazi concentration camps serves to anchor the philosophical notion of the inherence of human rights. So the Holocaust, which was said to have shocked the conscience of mankind, provided the moral impetus for the Universal Declaration. Well, there's an intuitive appeal to this argument, although I wonder if it makes more sense only retrospectively. Like, is that what they were thinking at the time, or are we just looking back and projecting our own views onto history? But anyways, which argument do you find more compelling? Moyne's revisionist account, which downplays the period of the 1940s, or Morsink's more conventional account, which highlights the role of the Holocaust? Reading 4 is by historian Nathan Kurtz, who tackles the debate between Moyne and Morsink head-on in the opening paragraphs. Now, this piece falls somewhere in the middle, although the concern here is more methodological. The author looks at the UN bureaucrats who were responsible for producing the summary records and other preparatory material that went into the negotiations behind the Universal Declaration and the UN Genocide Convention, both of which were adopted by the UN General Assembly on back-to-back days in December 1948. So it's crucial to understand that these records are not verbatim accounts, but are rather second-hand, decontextualized summaries. Accordingly, the author argues that these UN bureaucrats systematically removed references to the Holocaust in order to attend to an international legal culture of formalism that is forward-looking and has minimal regard for history and socio-political context. So the goal here is to simply understand the limitations of the primary source material. Reading 5 is by David Myers, who specializes in international relations and diplomatic history. This piece argues, perhaps somewhat optimistically, that the UN Genocide Convention and the Universal Declaration together upheld a vision of humanity over that of sovereign states. So, whereas before World War II, the principle of inviolable state sovereignty reigned supreme, after the war, supposedly, state sovereignty was at least nominally conditioned by the humanitarian pretense of the United Nations. Anyways, the article starts with a well-trod recounting of Raphael Lemkin, the man who coined the word genocide, as well as the Nuremberg trials, before briefly covering the diplomatic politics at stake around the Genocide Convention, while also providing a revealing look at the domestic political debates in the US during the late 40s and early 50s over whether or not to ratify the Genocide Convention. So that's the first half of the article. The second half reviews the drafting process of the Universal Declaration, as well as the concomitant political debates, both at the UN and the US. Now, there's not much here that speaks to the Moyne-Morsink debate that we're covering this week, but if you want some more historical and political context, then definitely consider checking out this article. Finally, reading 6 is by Swiss-based American anthropologist Mark Goodall. Anthropologists have had something of a mixed approach to human rights. Reading 5, for instance, briefly mentions how the American Anthropological Association in 1947 critiqued the presumed universality of human rights, arguing instead that such rights were a product of the particular historical circumstances associated with the quote-unquote West. It was in this context that the article reconstructs the role of UNESCO in fashioning what the author calls the myth of universality. As with previous readings, this article gives us a glimpse into the internal politics of the UN, particularly with the rivalry between UNESCO and the UN Committee on Human Rights, the latter of which were tasked with drafting the Universal Declaration. So, long story short, UNESCO wanted to ascertain certain core convictions and beliefs that were supposedly universal to humanity, despite its enormous diversity of values. They attempted to canvass the world, or at least part of it, through a survey that was sent out to government officials, scholars, artists, trade unionists, theologians, and other luminaries of the era. Yet they only received a few dozen responses, the overwhelming majority of which came from the US and its Western allies. Very little came from the Global South, and only one was from a woman, so it hardly represented any universal values. But the point of this essay isn't to disprove the purported universality of human rights. Rather, it is to uncover how this purported universality has become mythologized as a cultural narrative. Okay, and that's pretty much it. Remember, you don't have to read all of these assigned readings. I just want you to pick 2 or 3 that you find the most interesting. We'll pick up our conversation on the discussion forum. In any case, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.